Now that the tree map has been put together, we'll bring that into Blender and use it to scatter some billboards. So I've got a blend file with the terrain and extended terrain all loaded in. Now I'm creating a plane which will basically be our tree generator plane. We'll use that, put the particle system on that scatters the trees. So basically copying the dimensions from the extended terrain, matching that with this new plane, and then zooming in and lining it up with the extended terrain, so they're basically in the same spot. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I just go ahead and zoom in real close and get it as close as I can. So now that that's lined up, I can start by renaming this to the tree generator, just so I know what it is. Hiding anything I don't need. And before I import a density map, I need to subdivide it several times to get the amount of vertices I need. I think I do it like 10 times. Make a new cube that will be kind of the tree placeholder. Add it to a group labeled trees. And I go ahead and make it 30 by 30 just so it, it's kind of an average size of a tree. My tutorial on the forums, how to do this, is what I always refer to when I forget the next step. So here I go, and I'm making the particle system. The emission number is shows how many trees will be placed. Going to 5,000 here. Kind of hunting through the different settings to match. For the render group, you choose the trees group. Make a new material, label it probability map or prob map. Import the tree map as a texture. Color space should be linear. And then we'll go hit tab, load that into the UV map. Then we switch over to vertex paint mode. Set the texture of the brush to our tree map texture and 3D brush mapping. And then just paint that onto our vertices. Sometimes the computer chokes down a little bit on this number of vertices, so it might take a few passes. And then I always zoom in just to make sure, because sometimes I've had situations where when I paint over the whole thing, it doesn't actually get all the vertices, and when you zoom in, you can see. So again, it just might take a couple different passes. So now I'm loading the weight and color script so that I can convert this gray map to a colored weight map. And the weight map is what the particle system will use to scatter the trees. So go into vertex groups, from density, select COL, the color map. And you can see now the cubes have been scattered basically according to the tree map. Now I'm going into the size of the render group just to make sure it matches the reference cube. Again, this is just for me to see how the billboards will overlap roughly. Then I go into the emissions section and kind of toggle between the different options just to try and get what looks like a natural scattering, comparing random versus jittered, even distribution checked or unchecked, adjusting the number of trees. You want it to be dense, but you don't want like a ton of overlap. because if you have a bunch of overlapping billboards in the game, it starts to look a little funky. So now I've saved this project, or this blend file. Okay, so you'll notice a lot of times the terrain object has these raised ridges on the edges of the map. So to avoid that and having trees floating in the air, I just go in and delete the outermost ring of vertices. So just going into edit mode, selecting the outermost row and column of vertices, and there we go. Now we have a nice clean terrain object. We can turn back on the extended terrain and everything should blend pretty smoothly. Saving again. So now I need to duplicate the terrain object and then extrude that the latest outermost ring of vertices to represent basically how the game interprets the terrain beyond the terrain itself. This will ultimately allow the trees to appear to sit directly on the extended terrain. So now I convert the tree generator particle system to individual objects. Make sure I deselect the tree generator object. So basically, whatever is selected here will be exported to the game. I've selected all the cubes. I hit snapping to closest, and from the top view, hit G so that everything snaps to the extended terrain or terrain height, which you could see just a second ago. And now I'm going through and deselecting any of these cubes, basically trees that I don't want in the game. So things on the very edge of the extended terrain that might look funky. Here I'm checking to see what might never be visible from the track. Again, if it's not visible when you're racing, why have it in the game? Just again to save resources. So I've noticed down in these valleys behind the track, those trees just aren't visible from the track. It goes down too deep unless you were riding way off into the extended terrain. You'd never see those trees anyway, so I'm deselecting those. Looking around to see if there's any other areas I can deselect. So yeah, again, in these valleys. It's just, to get the vegetation looking good, you just need a lot of objects or billboards, which can be taxing. So if there's any way to kind of trim things back where it's not noticeable visually, I like to go ahead and do that. And of course, you can always delete these in the game itself, but it's a lot quicker to do it here in Blender. So now I import this modified right placement script, which I will make sure there's a link to. Basically, it writes the placement of all the objects, including their vertical placement. So I export that. So now we'll hide the extended terrain and bring back that extruded in-game terrain and snap all our objects to that, so we'll get the actual in-game height data. We will use the right placement script to export those heights, and basically we will be able to subtract the in-game heights from the extended terrain heights to get the necessary values to make sure that the trees sit directly on the extended terrain and aren't floating in the sky somehow. Sounds kind of confusing, but just kind of follow along and trust me, it works. This may be an unnecessary step in Dreamweaver, or you could be using Notepad++. I'm just adding a space behind any forward brackets and before any ending brackets, just so they show up in a separate row when I pull this into Excel. Excel is where I kind of bring all of this data together. So first I'm opening up the trees based on the extended terrain height. And I've got a file full of the billboards used, and then the in-game trees, which is based on that kind of extruded terrain. So I'm going to select the height column from here, copy it, paste it over. Then again, copy the height of the extended terrain and create a formula that's basically the extended terrain height minus the in-game height. Copying, then pasting that to that whole column, reducing the decimal places a couple notches. And then here I actually realized I made a mistake. If you subtract 1 from the end of that formula, that just helps any trees that are on an angle to look more firmly seated in the ground in the game, so you don't see the bottom of the billboard. So I save that. And now I have this kind of list of all the billboards from last year. I don't know if this was from a particular track. It was probably it was probably from High Point last year, actually. So I'm just renaming this to MX 2020, current year. And sorting them by this first column kind of basically randomizes the trees. Now I select the scale, aspect ratio, and texture column of that and paste it into my working document. I know this is probably a little complicated and maybe doesn't make a ton of sense the way I'm describing it, but if you just kind of follow along and do the same thing, it will work. So yeah, I'm just pasting this as many times as I need to fill all the trees I've placed. That went a little too far, so I just need to delete the extra rows. So now for each billboard, there's basically a randomly selected tree billboard. Now I'm basically randomizing the heights. So I take the scale column, do rand between 50 and 100, and those numbers can vary depending on what you're going for, but I copy and pasted that to the rest of the column. And now I'm copying and pasting that over into the billboards file in Notepad++, and let's open it up in the game and see how it looks. So I'm just turning on the billboards, checking to see that everything's pretty much lined up as it should be, and it is. Now I'll just do a lap around the track just to see what I can see, make sure that nothing's looking too strange with the trees in the background, that I'm not seeing any obvious lines where I deleted things, and that the density looks appropriate. So far it's looking pretty good, looks pretty natural. There's trees out to the distance, nothing too crazy is happening. However, right there you see that dense section of trees. There's a bit of flickering. There you go, you can see it again, a bit of flickering happening, and then also some trees on the track there. So that's a couple issues I'll have to address. That's basically what happens if you have too many billboards crammed into a small area. Just taking another look. Things are looking pretty good overall, except for those flickery areas and the section where it crossed the track. I'm pulling in the updated track path and fence layout. Since it wasn't entirely clear where that was. So save that, pull up the game again. And then this section, since it's new, I'm pulling up a reference just to see kind of where those trees should be. Looks like I put the decals in the wrong order. Fix that. There we go. Now we can see where the fence and track path actually will be. So I'm just going in and deleting trees from within the fence. As you can see, there's only a couple that are inside the spectator fence. And those will most likely be statue trees anyway. I could go back to Blender, but at this point, it's a lot easier just to stay within the game. Blender's kind of just like a mass overall placement, and then any fine-tuning can be done in the game. Again, I'm just going back and forth to a reference video to see where things are in real life. So it looks like there's maybe a few too many trees on the right side right here. So I'm going in and moving a couple around, deleting a few. Hopefully that'll help the flickering issue in that turn. Kill a couple of overlaps. Save that. And that's about it for placing the billboards. The next step will be placing the statue trees.